The door swung open before Wilhelmina Atwood could even raise her fist to knock a second time, and the look on the rancher's face nearly broke her in two. She had rehearsed this moment for 300 miles. She had rehearsed it in the back of rattling stagecoaches and beneath the open, indifferent sky of the Wyoming territory. She had rehearsed it while little Clara slept against her shoulder, one small fist curled into the fabric of Wilhelmina's worn traveling coat like the child was afraid that even in sleep she might be taken away again. Wilhelmina had rehearsed calm. She had rehearsed dignity. She had rehearsed the precise, careful words she would use to explain who she was, why she had come, and why the man standing in the doorway of the Double M Ranch owed her, or at the very least, owed the truth. What she had not rehearsed was the way Stephen Mercer's face went through 6 distinct expressions in the span of 2 heartbeats when his eyes landed on her. Confusion, recognition, something that looked terribly close to grief. And then this was the part she had not expected, the part that rattled every carefully constructed wall she had built around herself over the past 18 months. He opened the door wider, not just a fraction. Not the polite, wary inch of a man checking on a stranger at his threshold. He pulled the door open fully, stepped back, and the lamplight from inside the ranch house spilled out onto the porch and lit up the dust still settling around Wilhelmina's boots, and it lit up Clara's dark curls, and it lit up the absolute devastation written across Wilhelmina's face, and Stephen Mercer said nothing. He simply held the door open and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and somehow that single wordless gesture cracked open something Wilhelmina had been sealing shut since the day she had learned her husband was already dead before she had ever even married him. Because Thomas Atwood had not been Thomas Atwood, and the man who had married her under false pretenses, the man who had fathered Clara and then vanished into the Wyoming wilderness 6 months before Clara was born, that man had a brother. A real brother, with a real name and a real ranch and a real life built in the shadow of a secret that had been festering for years. And that brother was Stephen Mercer. She had arrived with a child on her hip and a heart full of accusations, and the rancher opened the door wider, and God help her, she walked inside. That had been the 1st of October in the year 1882. To understand why that moment carried the weight it did, you have to go back. You have to go back to the spring of 1880, to the small railroad town of Laramie, Wyoming, where a woman named Wilhelmina Atwood was running a boarding house with her mother and trying, with considerable determination, to build a decent life out of the wreckage of a family that had been steadily falling apart since her father died of fever 3 winters prior. Wilhelmina was 25 years old that spring. She was not a fragile woman. She was the kind of woman who had learned to do sums at the age of 8 because her mother could not, and who had learned to negotiate with suppliers at 16 because her father was already sick. She was tall for the era, with reddish-brown hair she kept pinned severely back during the working hours, and gray eyes that people described, depending on their relationship with her, as either calculating or perceptive. She had opinions. She had a quick tongue. She had also, beneath all of that competent armor, a deep and quietly desperate longing for a life that was genuinely hers, not just managed and maintained and kept afloat. Thomas Atwood had walked into the boarding house on a Tuesday in April, trailing the specific kind of charm that Wilhelmina had always been suspicious of in theory and entirely defenseless against in practice. He said his name was Thomas Atwood, that he was a land surveyor working the territory, that he intended to settle once he had identified the right parcel. He was good-looking in a careless way, with laughing eyes and an easy manner, and he paid his room and board without complaint and helped carry luggage for the older guests and made Wilhelmina's mother laugh at supper 3 nights running. And he looked at Wilhelmina as though she was the most interesting thing in the county, which she had enough experience to know was a calculated thing, and yet, by June he had asked her to walk with him. By August he had asked her to marry him. By September, they were married in the small Methodist church on the edge of Laramie, with her mother weeping happy tears in the second pew and Wilhelmina wearing her best dress and telling herself that the small, persistent unease in her chest was just nerves and not something more dangerous. He was gone by December. A surveying contract in the Northern Territory, he said. Urgent. He would send for her when he was settled. He kissed her forehead at the stage depot and looked at her steadily and told her he would write every week, and he rode away. And the letters came for exactly 3 weeks and then stopped entirely. Clara was born in July of 1881, into a world where her father had already been missing for 7 months, and Wilhelmina had spent each of those 7 months cycling between fury and fear and a stubborn, battered hope that she was ashamed of even as she clung to it. It was a U.S. Marshal named Holt who came to the boarding house in October of that year, when Clara was 3 months old and Wilhelmina was running on 4 hours of sleep and sheer force of will. He sat across from her at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and his expression carefully composed, and he told her that the man she knew as Thomas Atwood was in fact a man named David Mercer, a known land swindler and confidence man with outstanding warrants in Colorado, Nebraska, and the Dakota Territory. He told her David Mercer had been found dead of a gunshot wound in a dry creek bed north of Cheyenne, likely the result of a deal gone wrong with one of several parties who had grievance with him. He told her the marriage was legal only in a technical sense, given that David Mercer had provided false identification to obtain the license, and that there were legal questions to be resolved. He also told her that David Mercer had a legitimate half-brother, one Stephen Mercer, who owned and operated a cattle ranch approximately 40 miles northwest of Laramie, and who had, as far as the marshal could determine, nothing to do with his brother's criminal activities, and everything to lose from the scandal of being publicly associated with them. Wilhelmina had sat very still through all of this. Then she had thanked Marshal Holt for his time and shown him out, gone upstairs, and sat on the edge of her bed with Clara asleep in the cradle beside her and looked at the wall for a very long time. She did not cry. She had not cried in months. She was not certain she still could. What she felt was a cold, specific fury directed at a dead man who could not answer for what he had done. And beneath the fury, layered down deep where she barely admitted it to herself, was something even worse than anger. It was the humiliation of having believed, of having opened her carefully guarded heart to someone who had been performing the entire time, who had looked at her sharp and competent and lonely and seen an opportunity, not a person. She spent the winter making decisions. Clara grew and changed and began to smile with a toothless brightness that did something complicated to Wilhelmina's chest every single time. The boarding house kept running. Her mother grew frailer but did not falter. And Wilhelmina turned over the question of Stephen Mercer in her mind with the methodical patience of a woman who had learned long ago that raw feeling without direction was just damage. By spring of 1882, she had resolved 3 things. First, that she needed to know whether Stephen Mercer had been aware of his brother's deception and had perhaps even aided it in some fashion, because if he had, then she had legal avenues to pursue, and she intended to pursue every one of them without mercy. Second, that Clara deserved to know the full truth of her origins when she was old enough, and that required Wilhelmina to know the full truth first. Third, and this was the one she turned over most quietly, most carefully, most suspiciously, she needed to know whether David Mercer had ever spoken of her, whether there had been a moment, even one, that was real. She did not examine why that last thing mattered. She folded it away and focused on the practicalities. She arranged for her cousin to manage the boarding house for a month. She packed a trunk. She settled Clara on her hip, and on the 1st of October in 1882, she arrived at the Double M Ranch, 40 miles northwest of Laramie, on a hired wagon with the afternoon light going golden and brutal across the Wyoming plains. The ranch was larger than she had expected. She had expected something modest, perhaps struggling, given what she knew about David Mercer's tendency to bleed the people around him. Instead, the Double M was a working, thriving enterprise, a substantial ranch house built from good timber, a solid barn, a bunkhouse, corrals containing a respectable number of horses, and in the distance the slow-moving mass of a cattle herd. It looked like a place that had been built by someone who understood the value of patience and work. That detail annoyed her in a way she could not entirely account for. The wagon driver let her down at the gate. She walked the path to the front door with Clara on her hip and her chin level, and her heart hammering behind her ribs in a way she chose to interpret as righteous anger and absolutely nothing else. She knocked. She waited. She knocked again. And then the door opened, and Stephen Mercer looked at her, and she looked at him, and the door opened wider, and she walked inside. The interior of the ranch house was clean and warm and smelled of wood smoke, and something savory coming from the kitchen. There was a stone fireplace along the eastern wall with a good fire going against the October chill. The furniture was plain and solid. There were books on a shelf beside the fireplace, which she noticed involuntarily and which further annoyed her. Stephen Mercer closed the door behind them and said, "Sit down, please." His voice was low and careful. He was 30 years old, she would learn later, with dark hair going slightly longer than fashion strictly recommended, and eyes that were a specific shade of brown she would later spend an embarrassing amount of time trying to describe accurately in her own mind. He was built like a man who worked with his hands, broad through the shoulders, but he moved with a kind of deliberate quietness that did not match the expectation of that build. He looked like a man who had been waiting for something difficult to arrive. Wilhelmina sat. She settled Clara on her knee and looked at Stephen Mercer steadily and said, "You know who I am." It was not a question. He had recognized her, and that recognition meant he had known she existed, and that meant David had spoken of her, and she needed to know the shape of that. "I know your name," Stephen said. He sat across from her, not behind a desk or a table, no barrier, which she noted. "Wilhelmina, David mentioned you. Once, about 2 years ago, he said he had met a woman in Laramie he was going to marry. And you did not warn her." The words fell hard and flat between them. She watched his jaw tighten. "I did not know where to find you," he said. "I did not know his plans. David and I we did not have the kind of relationship where he shared his plans with me." He paused. "He shared very little with me, by design." "By design," she repeated. "He was ashamed of me," Stephen said, and the matter-of-fact quality of the statement, the absence of self-pity in it, caught her off guard. Or more accurately, he was ashamed that I refused to operate the way he did. We had the same mother, different fathers. His father had money and no ethics. Mine had neither, but he was honest. David never forgave me for choosing the version of the family that stayed poor and clean over the one that got rich and dirty. Wilhelmina looked at him for a long moment. Clara, with the perfect timing of infants turned toddlers, chose this moment to reach up and grab Wilhelmina's carefully pinned hair with both fists and yank with impressive determination. Wilhelmina extracted herself with practiced efficiency and did not break eye contact with Stephen Mercer. "He's dead," she said. "I know. Did you grieve?" Something moved across his face. "I grieved what we should have been to each other," he said, "not what we were." That answer cost him something, she could see that. She filed it carefully. "I need to know everything," she said. "Everything you know about what he did, who he was, what he told you about Laramie, about me. I need to know if you had any part in it, any knowledge that could have protected me that you chose not to share. And I need to understand whether this child—" She tilted her head toward Clara, who was now investigating the buttons on Wilhelmina's coat with profound seriousness. "Has any legal standing with respect to the Mercer name, because I was told the marriage was technically legal despite the false documentation, and I intend to understand what that means for her future." Stephen Mercer looked at Clara with an expression that Wilhelmina could not entirely read, and it frightened her, the way it frightened her, the way it moved something in her chest before she could stop it. "I'll tell you everything I know," he said, And then I'd like you to tell me about her if you're willing." Wilhelmina said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Her name is Clara." He nodded slowly. "She has David's eyes," he said, "but I don't think she has his expression." "No," Wilhelmina said quietly. "She doesn't." The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and went places Wilhelmina had not anticipated. Stephen told her the history with a directness that she respected despite herself. The way you respect a surgeon's precision, even when the surgery hurts. He told her about growing up the son of a ranch hand, while his half-brother David grew up in a house in Denver with carpets and a library. About the way David had appeared periodically throughout their youth like a bad weather front, charming and ruinous in equal measure. He told her about the 2 times he had tried to intervene in David's schemes over the years, once to prevent a land swindle in Colorado that he had gotten wind of, and once to warn a family in Nebraska that David was falsely representing himself as a government land agent. Both times David had anticipated the interference and moved before Stephen could act. Both times the damage was done. He told her that after the second attempt, David had come to the Double M in a cold fury and told Stephen that if he interfered again, he would destroy the ranch. David had connections, he said, with men who could manufacture debt claims, boundary disputes, any number of legal nightmares that could swallow a ranch like Stephen's whole. And so Stephen had made a terrible calculation. He had chosen the ranch, chosen the 30 families whose livelihood depended on the Double M, and he had stopped pursuing his brother's activities. He was not asking for her forgiveness as he said this. He was simply telling her the truth, and the truth was ugly, and he knew it. "You could have gone to a marshal," Wilhelmina said. "I did," he said. "In the spring of 1880, I filed a report with a U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne about David's activities. The marshal I spoke to told me that without specific victims willing to come forward, without documented losses, there was nothing legally actionable." He looked at her steadily. "I have thought about that report every day since I found out what David did to you." The silence between them was full of texture. Wilhelmina sat with it, testing its edges. "You filed a report in spring of 1880, she said. "April," he said. "He arrived at my boarding house in April of 1880, she said. The way Stephen's eyes closed briefly told her he already knew that he had already done that arithmetic and lived with it. "I'm sorry," he said. It was simple and unadorned, and she believed it, and that almost made it worse. She stayed the night. She had not planned to. She had booked a room at the nearest town, a 2-hour ride away. But the afternoon had run long into evening while they talked, and Clara had fallen deeply asleep against Wilhelmina's shoulder somewhere around the second hour, and Stephen's housekeeper, a broad, competent woman named Mrs. Hannigan, who had been with the ranch for 15 years, had appeared with supper without being asked, and had taken one look at Clara asleep, and at Wilhelmina's exhausted face, and had gone to prepare the guest room with a brisk efficiency that invited no argument. Wilhelmina lay awake that night in the guest room with Clara breathing softly beside her, and looked at the ceiling of Stephen Mercer's ranch house, and tried to take a complete and honest inventory of what she was feeling. Anger, yes. That was familiar and reliable. Grief, layered and complicated, not just for herself, but for what she could see on Stephen Mercer's face when he talked about his brother, that specific grief of loving someone who was unworthy of it and knowing it and continuing to love them anyway. And something else, something she had no intention of naming yet, something that had gotten in through a gap she had not noticed was open. She told herself it was simply the relief of finally knowing the truth. It was reasonable that knowing the truth would produce an emotional response. She told herself that and went to sleep. In the morning she found Stephen Mercer at the kitchen table with coffee and a ledger, and he looked up when she came in and said, "Clara slept well." "She always sleeps well," Wilhelmina said. "It's one of her more aggravating qualities. She manages the difficult things effortlessly while I manage them with great effort." Something that was very nearly a smile crossed his face. "Coffee," he said. "Please," she said. She had intended to leave after breakfast. She stayed for 3 days. She told herself she was staying because there were still questions that needed answering, and that was partly true. There were practical questions, legal questions, questions about what documentation existed regarding her marriage to David Mercer and what rights Clara might have. Stephen had a lawyer in Laramie he trusted and had already, by the second morning, sent a letter via his ranch hand requesting a consultation. That was the kind of man he was, she was learning. He identified a problem, and he moved on it quietly and without fanfare. And there was something deeply disorienting about encountering that quality in a person after a year of dealing with the aftermath of its opposite. But she also stayed because of Clara. Clara took to the ranch with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a 15-month-old confronted with horses, chickens, wide open spaces, and a large and gentle cattle dog named Dutch, who appeared to regard Clara as a personal responsibility from the first moment. She toddled out onto the porch. Watching her daughter move through this place, seeing Clara's delight at the sheer aliveness of it, something shifted in Wilhelmina's chest that she could not ignore. The boarding house in Laramie was decent. It was what she knew and what she had managed and what had kept them fed and housed. But it was not this. It was not the October sun broad and golden over grassland that went on until it became sky. It was not Dutch the cattle dog lying at the edge of the porch with one eye on Clara. It was not the sound of the morning genuinely quiet in a way that a town was never quiet. On the third morning, Stephen Mercer found her at the fence of the near pasture, watching the horses move in the early light, and stood beside her for a while in silence and then said, "You're thinking about something difficult." "I'm always thinking about something difficult," she said. "Different from yesterday's difficult," he said. She looked at him sideways. He was watching the horses too, not pressing her, just present. The collar of his work shirt was turned up against the morning cold, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes that she thought had more to do with squinting into the prairie sun than with age. "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "about what I am going back to, and what Clara is going back to, and whether the life I have built is genuinely what I chose or simply what was left after everything else was taken." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've thought about similar things. About whether this place is genuinely what I chose or whether it's what I built to survive my brother's existence, because if I had something solid and real that was mine, something he could threaten but not ultimately take, then I had leverage against the fear." She turned to look at him properly. "Is that why you built it?" "Partly," he said. "But I also love it. Genuinely. The work and the land and the animal of running a place like this, all of it. And that's the complicated thing about choices made from fear. Sometimes they lead you to genuine love anyway." She turned back to the horses. The morning light was doing something unreasonable to the mountains on the far horizon. "I need to go back," she said. "I have responsibilities in Laramie that I cannot simply abandon." "I know," he said. "But I think I'll come back," she said, and was surprised to hear the words come out of her mouth before she had fully decided on them. He turned to look at her and she could feel it without turning her head. "I'd like that," he said. His voice was very quiet. She went back to Laramie. She spent 2 weeks there putting things in order with a degree of focused efficiency that her cousin remarked on with some alarm. She met with a local lawyer about the questions surrounding her marriage, and the lawyer in turn corresponded with Stephen's lawyer, and the legal picture that emerged was this. The marriage to David Mercer, contracted under a false name, was legally void and could be formally annulled on those grounds. Clara's parentage was biological fact regardless of the marriage status, and Clara had the right to carry either her mother's name or her father's actual name. But as David Mercer had died intestate, and his estate was effectively non-existent, having been largely the product of ongoing swindles that produced no real assets, Clara would inherit nothing material from his side. What she could inherit, potentially, was a connection to the legitimate Mercer family, specifically to an uncle who was alive and solvent, and who had written a letter to Wilhelmina's lawyer expressing a desire to be part of Clara's life, if Wilhelmina would permit it. Wilhelmina read that letter twice. Then she read it a third time. She folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, close to her chest, and went and found her mother in the sitting room. Her mother, whose name was Agnes and who had the sharp eyes and gentle manner of someone who had watched the world carefully for 60 years without becoming either cynical or naive, looked up from her mending and looked at her daughter and said, "Tell me about the rancher." Wilhelmina sat down. "I have not said anything about a rancher." "You have not had to," Agnes said. "Tell me." So Wilhelmina told her. She told her about Stephen Mercer with the precision she brought to everything, measuring her words, keeping her voice level, and watching her mother's face the entire time. And her mother listened and finished a seam and started another, and when Wilhelmina was done she said, "He sounds like a man who has been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Wilhelmina said. "For something worth staying for," Agnes said, as though this was obvious. "He has the ranch. He has the work. But you describe a man who is alone in a specific way, not for lack of company, but for lack of something that matches him. And you, my love, have been alone in the same specific way for a long time." "His brother destroyed my life," Wilhelmina said, because she needed to say it even though the sharp edge of it had been blunting without her permission. "His brother destroyed what you had built," Agnes said, "and now you have a chance to build something else. These are not the same thing." She bit a thread. "Also, that man wrote a letter to your lawyer about being part of Clara's life. That tells you more about his character than anything else you've described." Wilhelmina was quiet. "I am frightened," she said, which was the truest thing she had said out loud in a very long time. "I know," Agnes said. "Go anyway." She went back to the Double M in November. This time she drove herself in a rented buggy, which the livery man in town regarded with some skepticism, and which she disregarded entirely. The road northwest out of Laramie was cold, and the sky was the specific hard gray of a Wyoming November, and Clara sat bundled in the seat beside her eating a piece of dried apple and narrating the journey with the verbal enthusiasm of a child who had recently discovered that words were both powerful and endlessly available. Stephen met them at the gate. He must have seen the buggy coming from a long way off because he was there, in his coat, Dutch the cattle dog beside him. And when Clara saw the dog she made a sound of such pure delight that Wilhelmina felt her own face do something she could not control. "You came back," he said, and his voice had something in it that was carefully not too much. "I said I would," she said, climbing down. "You did," he said. He reached up automatically to help her down, and their hands met, and neither of them made a thing of it, but neither of them hurried to separate either. She stayed for 2 weeks that time. And something began that was not dramatic in the way of the stories she had read, not sudden or explosive or accompanied by the kind of speech-making that novels suggested was appropriate to the occasion. It was quieter than that and more dangerous, because quieter things got in deeper before you could defend against them. They worked. That was the truth of it. She was not the kind of woman who sat decoratively while life happened around her, and the Double M was a working ranch in November, which meant there was always something that needed doing. She helped Mrs. Hannigan with the kitchen work. She helped balance the ranch's accounts when she discovered by accident that Stephen was doing them longhand without the shortcut methods she had learned running the boarding house. And she showed him a faster approach and watched him look at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something. She rode out with him one afternoon to check on a section of fence that had been reported damaged. Clara bundled in front of her on the horse with an expression of supreme satisfaction, and they worked the fence side by side in the cold afternoon and talked about everything and nothing, about the territory and the railroad and the changing shape of the cattle business, about books they had read and opinions they had formed and places they had each wanted to see and had not yet gotten to. And one evening they sat in front of the fire after Clara was asleep, and Stephen said, "Tell me about what you wanted, before all of it, what you imagined your life would be." She looked at the fire for a while, I wanted to matter, she said finally, not in a grand way. I didn't want to be famous or important in the way that gets written about. I wanted to matter to something specific, to build something real with someone who actually saw me, not the capability of me, not the usefulness of me. He was quiet. The fire said things they weren't saying. I have been thinking, he said carefully, since you came back the first time, about what it would mean to ask you something. And I have been trying to determine whether it is too soon and whether I am doing it for the right reasons, and whether you would hear it as an insult given what my brother did. Wilhelmina's heart did something sudden and unreasonable. She kept her voice very level. You should probably just ask the thing, she said. I don't want you to go back to Laramie, he said. I want you to stay. I want you and Clara to be here with me permanently. I want to court you properly if you'll let me as long as you need, and I want you to know that what I feel for you is not charity or obligation or guilt about David. I see you. I have been seeing you since you walked through my door with your chin up and your heart broken and your eyes like a woman who will not be beaten even though she is very tired. And I have been, he stopped, looked at the fire, looked back at her. I have been falling in love with you, Wilhelmina, and I realize that may be a terrible thing to say given everything, but I cannot think of a version of honesty that does not include saying it. The room was very quiet. The fire spoke. Wilhelmina sat with what he had said and felt it move through her, honest and warm and terrifying, and thought about her mother saying go anyway, and thought about Clara's face on the horse that afternoon, and thought about the way Stephen Mercer had filed that report in April of 1880 and lived with the weight of it every day since. I am not ready to say the same thing back to you yet, she said. I want you to understand that clearly and not read it as a refusal. I understand, he said, but I am also not going back to Laramie, she said. At least not permanently, at least not yet, she paused. I'd like to stay for the winter and see what the winter tells us. He nodded. His face did something quiet and luminous that he immediately restrained, and she found that restraint somehow more moving than the luminescence itself. Then stay, he said. She stayed. The winter on the Double M was the hardest physical experience of Wilhelmina Atwood's life, and also, without any contest, the most alive she had felt in years. Wyoming winter in 1882 was not a gentle affair. The cold arrived in December with the absolute conviction of something that had never intended to leave, and the snow followed it, and the work of keeping a ranch running through genuine winter weather was immense and constant, and required every person present to function at full capacity every single day. Wilhelmina functioned at full capacity. She managed the household accounts with a rigor that surprised even Mrs. Hannigan, who was a formidable woman not easily surprised. She learned the rhythms of the ranch work, not as a participant in the heavy physical labor, which was the domain of Stephen and his ranch hands, but as the intelligent, organized center that kept everything tracked and supplied and accounted for. She wrote to her mother twice a week. She wrote to her lawyer about the formal annulment which was proceeding, and she watched Stephen Mercer. She watched him with the same perceptive precision she brought to everything, and what she observed was a man who was genuinely good in the way that was not easy or passive, but active and chosen. She watched him settle a dispute between two of his ranch hands with a fairness that left both men feeling heard, even though only one of them got the outcome they wanted. She watched him extend credit quietly to a neighboring family whose winter had gone badly, in a way that preserved their dignity by being offered so matter-of-factly that it could not be received as charity. She watched him with Clara, who by December had decided that Stephen was among the three most important beings in the universe, Dutch the dog and Wilhelmina being the other two. He was careful with Clara in a way that she recognized as both love and caution. Love because it was simply there in his eyes every time the child came near him, and caution because he was not trying to replace something or perform something. He was simply present for whatever Clara needed on any given day. She watched all of this, and she felt the last of the careful walls come down, stone by stone, in the cold Wyoming winter, and she waited until she was sure. She had not been sure before with David. She had been enchanted and hopeful and willfully blind to her own unease, and she had called it certainty when it was only wanting. She knew the difference now. On a Thursday evening in January, with a blizzard making the world outside the ranch house windows into a white roar, and Clara asleep upstairs and Mrs. Hannigan gone to visit her sister in town before the weather had closed the road, Wilhelmina set down her account book and looked across the table at Stephen Mercer, who was reading by the lamp with his hair slightly disheveled from a long day and Dutch asleep on his feet, and she said, "I'm in love with you." He looked up from his book. His face went still in the way of a man who was not sure he had heard correctly. "I wanted you to know," she said. "I wanted to say it when I was certain, and I am certain now." He closed the book. He put it down on the table with the very precise care of a man who needed to do something with his hands to stay contained. "Wilhelmina," he said. "You don't need to respond in kind," she said, because old habits of self-protection were hard to fully kill. "I know you've said it already, and I just wanted you to know I've—" "Wilhelmina," he said again, and this time he was standing, and he came around the table and she stood up, and he took her face in both of his hands with a gentleness that was devastating, and he looked at her with those dark brown eyes from 3 inches away and said, "I have been waiting for you to say that since November." "2 months," she said. "I'm sorry it took 2 months. It could have taken 10 years, he said. "I would still have waited." And then he kissed her, and it was nothing like the first time David had kissed her, which had been a performance of tenderness, all calculated warmth with nothing real beneath it. This was a man who had been holding something carefully and now let it be what it was, and what it was nearly undid her entirely. They were both breathless when they parted. The blizzard was very loud outside. The fire was very warm inside. "I should like to marry you," he said, "when you're ready. When the annulment is finalized and when you have had enough time to be sure this is what you want and not a response to the winter and the circumstances." She laughed, which surprised them both. "You are being very careful," she said. "You deserve careful," he said. "You have not been treated with care before. I intend to be the thing that corrects that for the rest of my life if you'll let me." She held his gaze for a long, clear moment. "Yes," she said, "I'll let you." "Not to the proposal yet," he said carefully. "Just yes, you'll give it the time it needs." "Yes," she said, "to both." He smiled then. A full and genuine smile that she had not seen from him before. Not the careful near smile she had catalogued, but the real thing, and it remade his face entirely. "Good," he said. The annulment was finalized in March of 1883. The paperwork arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a writer from Laramie, and Wilhelmina stood on the porch of the Double M and read it through twice in the cold morning air and felt something settle inside her, some long-braced tension release at last. It was done. The legal fiction of her marriage to David Mercer was officially, formally dissolved. Clara was legally registered as Clara Atwood, bearing her mother's name, with her parentage accurately documented. She brought the paperwork inside and put it on the kitchen table and went to find Stephen in the barn. He was working with one of the mares, a gentle quarter horse named Rosie who was 3 months along and whom Stephen checked on every morning with the specific concern he gave to all his animals' welfare. He looked up when she came in and read the look on her face. "It came," he said. "It came," she confirmed. He set down the brush and came to her and took her hands. "How do you feel?" She considered this honestly. "Free," she said. "Genuinely free, which is frightening because I did not realize how much I had not felt free until this very moment." He squeezed her hands. "Then we can do this properly," he said. "If you're still willing." "More than willing," she said. He had not bought a ring yet because he was the kind of man who would not presume in that way. But he had, she would discover later, gone into Laramie in February and spoken with the jeweler there, describing what he knew of her preferences, her practical nature, her dislike of ostentation, her love of clean lines. And the jeweler had set aside a ring that matched that description. A simple gold band set with a small garnet the color of September, not flashy, not fragile, exactly right. He gave it to her that evening after supper with Clara on his knee pulling at Dutch's ears, with Mrs. Hannigan conspicuously finding urgent business in the kitchen, and he held it out in his open palm without ceremony and said, "Wilhelmina Atwood, will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and at his face and at Clara, who had stopped harassing the dog and was looking between the two adults with the bright, interested expression of a child who does not understand the words but understands entirely the weight of the moment. "Yes," Wilhelmina said, "I will absolutely marry you," Clara said, with the perfect timing that was becoming characteristic of her. "Dutch." They both burst into laughter, and that laughter, warm and helpless and full of real joy, was perhaps the most honest thing either of them had produced in years. They were married in May of 1883 in the Methodist Church in Laramie, which was the same church where Wilhelmina had married David Mercer 3 years earlier under entirely different circumstances, and she had thought she might find that difficult, stepping back into that space. Instead, she found that the church was simply a building, and buildings took their character from what happened inside them, and what was happening inside it now was entirely different from what had happened before. Her mother was in the front pew, upright and tearful and radiant. Clara was in a white dress that Mrs. Hannigan had made for her, and was attending with the dignity that 3-inch toddlers brought to formal proceedings, which is to say intermittently, and with frequent diversions. Stephen's ranch hands filled several rows on his side, clean-shaved and clearly uncomfortable in their dress clothes, and genuinely happy in a way that told Wilhelmina something true about the man she was marrying. The minister read the words. They said the right things. And when Stephen Mercer looked at her and said, "I do," he looked at her with the specific and complete attention of a man who meant every syllable of those 2 words with every part of himself. And Wilhelmina felt the last of the betrayal and the dark past, and the long, exhausting weight of everything that had come before dissolve in the May sunlight coming through the church windows. She had been so careful. She had been so right to be careful. And now she was done being careful, at least in that particular way. The reception was held at the Double M, and it lasted until well past dark, and there was music from a fiddle player who had come from town with 3 of his friends, and there was food enough for twice the number of people present. And Mrs. Hannigan cried and pretended she was not crying, and Clara danced with Dutch in a manner that was deeply heartfelt and technically questionable. And Agnes Atwood cornered Stephen Mercer near the porch railing and spoke to him quietly for a good 10 minutes, and whatever she said to him made him nod with great seriousness, and then smile with genuine warmth. And Wilhelmina across the yard watched this and felt something so complete and so unexpected that she had to look away to keep herself from being overwhelmed by it. Her mother came and stood beside her a little later. "I like him," Agnes said. "I know," Wilhelmina said. "What did you say to him?" "I told him about your father," Agnes said. "About who your father was at his best and what kind of standard that set in your mind for what a man could be. And I told him you had been waiting your whole life for someone to meet that standard, and that I thought he could do it and that I was trusting him with the most precious thing I had." Wilhelmina looked at her mother. "And he said he knew," Agnes said simply. "And he intended to spend the rest of his life being worthy of the trust." The first year of their marriage was not without its difficulties. The ranch had a hard summer that year, with a drought that came in June and stayed through August, and tested the water situation along the Double M's southern range. Stephen dealt with it with a composed persistence that Wilhelmina found herself drawing on as a model, and she drew on her own resources, going through the account books and finding efficiencies she had not noticed before, and corresponding with ranchers to the north about water-sharing arrangements, and generally approaching the crisis as the practical problem it was rather than as a catastrophe. They worked through it together, and working through something hard together did a different kind of bonding than simply enjoying each other's company. And by the time the autumn rains came back and the crisis eased, they both knew something about each other that could not be learned any other way. She also dealt that year with the lingering social complexity of her history in a community that knew it. The Wyoming Territory in 1883 was not a place where a woman's past was easily forgiven, and there were people in Laramie and in the surrounding area who regarded her with the specific calculation of those who saw David Mercer's widow, false widow, technically, as either pitiable or suspicious depending on their nature. She met this with the same chin-level steadiness with which she met everything, and Stephen beside her met it with a quiet and immovable dignity that made those calculations simply irrelevant. They were the Mercers. They were a fact. The community could recalibrate accordingly. What helped most, perhaps, was that she was simply herself, fully and without apology in every interaction. She was competent and direct and fair. She had an eye for injustice, and she named it when she saw it, which some people found abrasive and others found remarkable. When a neighboring family's Shoshone farm hand was refused service at the general store in town, Wilhelmina walked in with him and stood at the counter until the storekeeper served them both, and then she gave her custom to the other merchant in town for the following 6 months, and she was not quiet about why. Stephen did not tell her to moderate this. He simply stood alongside it. Clara thrived. She was a bright, energetic child who had acquired Dutch as a permanent shadow and who was developing both a love of horses and a facility with language that Wilhelmina recognized with both pleasure and mild concern as her own trait emerging. She called Stephen Papa for the first time on a Tuesday morning in February, without preamble or ceremony, and Stephen had gone very still and then picked her up and held her with a careful, quiet intensity that Wilhelmina watched from the doorway and did not interrupt. That evening he had said to Wilhelmina, "I want to adopt her, legally. I want her to be mine in the way that is protected and permanent." "She's already yours," Wilhelmina said. "She has been since November." "I know," he said. "I want the law to know it too." The adoption was filed in the spring of 1884 and granted in August of the same year. Clara became Clara Mercer, and if she ever missed being Clara Atwood, she did not show it in any way that Wilhelmina could detect. What she showed was a child who was rooted, who knew where she belonged, who ran toward her father with the confidence of someone who had never had a reason to doubt that running toward him would be met. It was in the late summer of 1884 that Wilhelmina realized she was expecting another child. She had the specific certainty of a woman who had been through it before, that quiet internal knowing, before any of the other signs were clear. She told Stephen on an evening when they were sitting on the porch watching the sun go down behind the mountains, which was something they did as often as the work permitted, a ritual that had become one of her private definitions of home. She said simply, "We're going to have another child." He turned to look at her. His face did the thing it did when something moved him that contained luminousness. "When?" he said. "March, I think," she said. "Possibly early April." He took her hand. He held it with both of his carefully as though she were something extraordinary which she had come to accept that he would always treat her as and which she had come to believe he genuinely meant. "How do you feel?" he said. "Good," she said, which was true. "A little frightened, a little wonderstruck." She paused. "Happy, genuinely and completely happy, which is still slightly alarming to me." "Stop being alarmed by it," he said. "I'm working on it," she said. He raised her hand and pressed his lips against it, a gesture so simple and so thoroughly his that she felt it the full length of her. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" she said. "For coming to my door," he said. "For knocking, for walking in, for staying." She looked at the mountains. The light was extraordinary, gold and deep amber, painting everything in the colors of something that mattered. "Thank you for opening the door wider," she said. He looked at her with those dark eyes that she had spent 2 years mapping and still found new things in. "Always," he said. Their son was born on the 28th of March, 1885, in the bedroom of the Double M Ranch house, delivered by the doctor who had ridden out from Laramie in the pre-dawn hours through a cold spring rain. The labor was long and Wilhelmina was characteristically fierce through it, which the doctor remarked on to Stephen in the hallway in a tone that was equal parts admiration and mild exhaustion. Stephen, who had spent 11 hours in a state of controlled terror that he was not going to admit to anyone, simply nodded and asked when he could go in. When he did, Wilhelmina was sitting up against the pillows with the baby in her arms and the specific expression of a woman who has just accomplished something extraordinary and is still in the immediate, stunned aftermath of it. The baby was red-faced and vocal and had dark hair that was clearly going to be an opinion. "Come here," Wilhelmina said. He came. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and the look on his face was something Wilhelmina would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. "What shall we call him?" she said. "I thought," he stopped, started again. "I thought if you were willing, James, for your father." She had not expected that. She had not expected him to have been thinking about her father, to have known that name would matter. She pressed her lips together for a moment and then said, "James Mercer." "James Robert Mercer," he said, "if you want the middle name." "Robert was my father's middle name," she said. "I know," he said. "You told me last winter when you were telling me about him." She looked at him. She had been doing that for 3 years and she had never stopped finding things worth seeing. "James Robert Mercer," she said. "Yes." Clara, who had been permitted to come in once the doctor confirmed everything was well, appeared in the doorway with Dutch hovering behind her and looked at the baby with the serious interest of a 4-year-old confronting a new and unpredictable variable in her life. "Is that my brother?" she said. "That's your brother," Wilhelmina confirmed. Clara considered this for a moment. "He's very small," she said. "He'll grow," Stephen said. "Dutch was small too," Clara said, with the tone of someone offering reassurance. And then she came and climbed onto the bed beside her parents with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who knew exactly where she belonged. And Dutch settled himself at the foot of the bed with the gravity of a creature taking on a new responsibility. And the 5 of them were in the room together in the March morning, and the rain outside was gentling into something quieter. Agnes Atwood came to stay for the first month after James was born, and she was in her element, managing the household with the comfortable authority of a woman who has been waiting to grandmother properly. She and Mrs. Hannigan formed a highly efficient domestic alliance that freed Wilhelmina to recover and to fall deeply, completely in love with her son, in the way that only the earliest weeks of motherhood permitted, that time before the world fully reinserted itself and demanded other things. She also, in those weeks, had long conversations with her mother in the evenings while the house was quiet, the kind of honest, unguarded conversations that the urgency of normal life tended to prevent. They talked about Agnes's own marriage, and about Wilhelmina's father, and about what they had built together and what had been hard and what had been worth it. They talked about David Mercer for the last time with a finality that felt right, an acknowledgement and a release. Agnes said, "He gave you Clara, that is the only thing I can say for him, and even that he did unintentionally. And he gave me the reason to find Stephen," Wilhelmina said. Agnes looked at her. "You would not have found him otherwise." "I don't know," Wilhelmina said honestly. "Perhaps not, or perhaps later differently. But this was the path that brought me here, and I cannot regret the path when I love the destination so completely." Agnes said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "That is either the most mature thing you have ever said or the most romantic." "Can it be both?" Wilhelmina said. "With you," Agnes said, "it usually is." Agnes went back to Laramie in late April, kissing the children and squeezing Stephen's hands and telling him with quiet sincerity that he was a good man, and the 3 words carried in them the full weight of what a good man meant to a woman who had once thought she was married to one and been wrong. Stephen received them accordingly. The summer of 1885 was a good one. The drought of the previous year had left the land hungry, and the rains of the spring fed it well, and the ranch was productive in a way that let Stephen turn his attention to some improvements he had been planning for 2 years, a better system for the southern water access, an expansion of the barn to accommodate additional horses. He brought Wilhelmina into every decision that had financial implication, not as a courtesy, but because he genuinely valued her thinking, and she gave that thinking freely and was not shy about disagreeing when she disagreed. They disagreed about the barn expansion. She thought the money was better spent on improving the bunkhouse for the ranch hands, who had been living in a structure that was functional but cold in winter in ways that went beyond acceptable. He had not been thinking of it in those terms. She laid out the reasoning that men who were warm and comfortable worked better and stayed longer, that turnover was a cost he was not accounting for properly in his planning, that the horses were adequate while the men were not, and he listened with the complete attention he brought to everything she said, and he agreed, and they changed the plan. The bunkhouse was improved first. 3 of his longest-serving ranch hands told him, separately and without knowing the others had done so, that it made a difference, and he told Wilhelmina this over supper and she filed it with satisfaction. "You were right," he said. "I usually am," she said, "but you knew that already." "I did," he agreed, and the smile he gave her was the full one, the real one. Clara started her formal education that autumn, with the teacher who came from Laramie to run the small school that served the scattered families in the area, a young woman named Miss Perkins who had gone east for her training and come back to the territory with genuine pedagogical ideas and excellent patience. Clara took to school with the same wholehearted enthusiasm she took to everything she decided was worth her time, and she came home in the afternoons full of information. She then relayed to Dutch in extensive detail, while the dog bore it with characteristic stoicism. James grew with the steady purposefulness of a healthy child who had decided that everything in the world was fascinating and worth investigating. He was walking by the time he was 10 months and talking with conviction, if not always clarity, shortly after. He had Wilhelmina's gray eyes and Stephen's dark hair, and a temperament that was distinctly its own, sunny and curious and occasionally stubborn, in a way that both parents recognized from specific angles. Stephen, watching James investigate a beetle on the porch one afternoon with the profound, focused interest of an 18-month-old confronting something new, said to Wilhelmina, "I was not prepared for this." "For parenthood," she said. "For loving someone so immediately and so completely that it rearranges your understanding of everything," he said. He looked at her. "I felt it with you, the rearranging, but it happened over time. With him it was instant, the moment I held him." "It was the same with Clara," she said. "Before she was born, I was trying to be practical about it. I told myself I would provide for her and care for her and be responsible. And then she arrived and the practicality was simply irrelevant. It just was love, immediately and without negotiation." "Yes," he said. "Exactly." He looked back at James, who had now decided that the beetle should be picked up and was approaching this with great strategic deliberation. "We should probably have more." She looked at him. "Is that a request?" "It is a desire honestly expressed," he said. "What you do with it is entirely your decision." She laughed. "You are very careful about framing things," she said. "You have taught me to be," he said. "You are a woman who does not appreciate having decisions made for her." "I am not," she agreed. "And yes, I'd like more, 2 more, I think. Let's see how we feel after that." 2 more, he said, and reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness so habitual it no longer seemed like a gesture and had become simply an expression. The way breathing was an expression. 2 more it is." She caught his hand against her face for a moment. He turned his palm against her cheek, and they sat there in the afternoon with James finally successfully conveying the beetle to an alternative location, and Dutch observing this from a respectful distance. And the mountains were blue and permanent in the far distance, and the ranch was alive with the sounds of horses and wind, and the ordinary extraordinary music of a day on the Double M. The winter of 1885 brought Agnes back to the ranch, this time not for a visit but to stay. Her health had been declining through the autumn in ways that were not alarming but were definitive, the kind of gentle narrowing of capacity that came with age, and with a body that had worked hard for decades. The boarding house had been sold in September to a young couple from Ohio who wanted it and could run it, and the sale had been straightforward and clean, and Agnes had stood in the empty parlor for a long moment before walking out, and Wilhelmina had been beside her, and they had not needed to say anything. Agnes moved into the Double M's guest room, which was sunny and south-facing, and she settled into the household with the ease of someone who had always belonged there, which in a very real sense she had. She was a beloved presence for the children, endlessly patient with James, and sparring with Clara in the specific intellectual way that Clara craved and Wilhelmina sometimes did not have the bandwidth for on top of everything else. She sat with Stephen in the evenings sometimes and talked about books and about history and about the territory, and he listened to her with genuine respect, and she came to regard him as the son she had not had, which she told him directly and without embarrassment, and which he received with a quiet dignity that honored the gift. She was there in the summer of 1886 when Wilhelmina's second son was born, a big, robust child who announced himself with considerable volume and who was named George after Agnes's father, and Agnes held him in the afternoon and said, "Hello, George," with such deep pleasure that the room was full of it. George Mercer was the family's comedian. He arrived in the world with an apparent commitment to joy that expressed itself early, in wide smiles and a belly laugh that he produced at an age when babies were not generally considered capable of it. And he grew into a child who found the funny angle on everything, and who made his older siblings laugh with a consistency that Stephen swore would either be an asset or a liability, depending on how it developed. Clara, now 6 and very senior in her own estimation, took her role as the eldest extremely seriously, which meant she was alternately bossy and fiercely protective of both brothers in a way that perfectly mirrored her mother, and which Wilhelmina recognized with simultaneous pride and exasperation. The ranch hands adored all 3 children. They had been there through the years, a corps of men who had worked the Double M long enough to consider themselves something like family, and they treated the Mercer children with the collective fond attention of a large and somewhat weathered set of uncles. There were stories told at the supper table. There was teaching, informal and constant, the things that ranch life taught whether you intended it to or not. Clara could ride better than most boys her age, and she knew it, and was entirely unapologetic about it, which was something Wilhelmina and Stephen were both privately delighted by. It was in the late autumn of 1886 that something happened that required a different kind of reckoning. A man arrived at the Double M on a gray afternoon, a man Wilhelmina did not recognize, but who Stephen clearly did from the way his posture changed when he saw him riding in. His name was Caldwell, and he had been one of David Mercer's associates, a man who had been present at some of the schemes, and who had managed to stay just far enough out of legal reach to avoid the consequences that had come to others. He was not a dangerous man in the physical sense, but he was a corrosive one, the kind of man who dealt in information as a currency, and who arrived now with a specific piece of information he intended to sell. He had found documentation, he said, correspondence between David Mercer and a third party that he suggested implicated Stephen in at least having knowledge of specific schemes earlier than Stephen had claimed to the marshal in 1880. Wilhelmina was present for this conversation. She had seen Stephen's face go through a series of changes when Caldwell had ridden in, and she had followed him to the door, and Caldwell had stated his case with the oily precision of a man who had practiced it. When Caldwell was done, Wilhelmina said, "What are you asking for?" Caldwell named a sum. It was not inconsiderable. Stephen said quietly, "I have nothing to hide. Whatever documentation you have, take it to the marshal. If it is genuine, I will answer for it. If it is fabricated, which I believe it is, you will answer for it." Caldwell had not expected that. He had expected fear, the kind of fear that opened wallets. He looked at Stephen and then at Wilhelmina, and he saw 2 people who were not afraid of him, and after a moment he left. Wilhelmina looked at Stephen when the door was closed. "Are you certain?" she said. "Completely," he said. "He has nothing real. I know what I did and what I didn't do. I have never been involved in David's activities, and any document suggesting otherwise is manufactured." "Then we do exactly what you said," she said. "And if he takes it further, we answer it." He looked at her for a moment. "You believe me," he said. "I have believed you for 3 years," she said simply. "Nothing about that man changes it." He crossed the room and held her, just held her, with the full weight of what that meant to him clear in the way his arms came around her. She held him back and felt his heart beating against her, and thought about the long distance between the woman who had arrived at this door in fury and fear, and the woman standing in this room now, and the distance was not absence but accumulation, not loss but becoming. Caldwell did not take it to the marshal. As Stephen had predicted, there was nothing real behind it. He disappeared back into whatever shadowed corner he had come from, and the double M continued as it had been. But the episode taught them something, which was that the past was not entirely finished with them, and perhaps never would be, and that was all right. They were not people who needed the past to be gone. They needed only to be grounded enough in the present that the past could not move them. Agnes Atwood died in the spring of 1887, peacefully, in her sunny south-facing room at the Double M, with Wilhelmina beside her, and the sound of Clara reading aloud in the next room carrying through the wall, which was what Agnes had asked for. She had said she wanted to go with the sound of a child reading, because it was the sound of something continuing, and she had gotten what she asked for. Wilhelmina grieved with the full and unguarded honesty that she had learned to allow herself in the years since coming to the Double M. She cried. She sat with the grief, and let it be what it was, and did not try to manage it into something more functional. Stephen sat with her through the worst of it with the same steady presence he brought to everything, not trying to fix or redirect, just there. And she was grateful for that kind of love in a way that was too deep for articulation. She buried her mother in the small cemetery at the edge of the Double M's western pasture, because Agnes had said she wanted to be near the sky and the grass and the children, and that was where she was. The children grew. The ranch prospered. The territory changed around them in the ways that the late 1880s brought to the West, the railroad expanding, towns growing, the open range beginning to be negotiated and structured in ways that required more legal and commercial attention than it had demanded before. Stephen navigated these changes with the same practical intelligence he brought to everything, building relationships with the right people, adapting his methods where adaptation was required, holding his ground where ground was worth holding. Wilhelmina became, over these years, something that she had not quite anticipated being, a person of genuine influence in the community. It had not been a goal. It had happened because she was herself in public the way she was at home, direct and fair and honest and willing to name both injustice and possibility when she saw them, and because people in a community like theirs were hungry for someone who dealt in straight talk. She was on the board of the local school by 1888. She was consulted on matters that had nothing to do with her formally, but which people brought to her because they trusted her judgment. She helped negotiate a water rights arrangement between 3 competing ranches that had been heading toward something ugly, and the arrangement held, and 2 of the 3 ranchers brought her gifts afterward that she accepted with a slightly embarrassed grace. Stephen watched all of this with uncomplicated pride. He never competed with it or resented it or tried to moderate it. She was who she was and he was who he was, and they were better together than either was alone, and he knew that with the settled certainty of a man who had done the work of knowing himself and knowing her. They had one more child, a daughter, born in the autumn of 1888, whom they named Agnes. She was small and dark-eyed and had from her earliest days the specific grave attention of someone who was taking careful notes on everything, and Clara, now 8 and an experienced sister, said when she first held her, "She's watching everything," with the tone of someone recognizing a kindred spirit. "She gets it from your mother," Stephen said to Wilhelmina. "She gets it from both of us," Wilhelmina said. "Fair," he said. On an October evening in 1889, the exact month and almost the exact date of her arrival 7 years earlier, Wilhelmina Atwood Mercer stood on the porch of the Double M Ranch house as the sun went down behind the mountains in colors that were frankly unreasonable, gold and copper, and a deep burning amber that turned the whole sky into something that looked like someone's private idea of extraordinary. She had a cup of coffee in her hand that was going cold because she kept forgetting to drink it. Dutch's successor, a younger cattle dog named Buck who had the same apparent sense of personal responsibility toward the Mercer family that Dutch had carried, was lying at her feet with one eye open. Clara was inside doing her schoolwork with the focused intensity she brought to everything academic, occasionally arguing with George about something in the specific way that 8-year-old and 3-year-old siblings argued, which was with complete conviction and very little logical coherence. James was somewhere in the barn with one of the ranch hands, pursuing his current obsession with how harnesses worked. Baby Agnes was asleep. Stephen came out and stood beside her. He was 40 years old, and there was more gray in his hair than there had been 7 years ago, and the lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper, and Wilhelmina thought he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, which she recognized as neither objective nor rational and did not particularly care. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him, which she did without thinking now, as naturally as breathing. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She looked at the mountains. 7 years ago," she said. "I was standing at your gate in October with a toddler on my hip and so much anger I could barely see through it, and I knocked on your door. And I opened it," he said. "And you opened it wider," she said. "I always think about that, not just that you opened it, but that you opened it all the way, as though you already knew I should come in." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know," he said. "I hoped. I had been hoping without knowing I was hoping for a long time, for someone to arrive who would make the house feel like it was being used for what it was built for." "What is it built for?" she said, though she knew. "This," he said. "Everything you see in there. The noise and the children and the work and the love and the arguing about harnesses. All of it. The house was built for exactly this." She turned to look at him, and he looked back at her with 7 years of knowing in his eyes, and the future still open in front of them, and everything that had happened between his door opening and this moment real and solid in theirs. "Then it's good we're using it properly," she said. He smiled at her, the full and genuine smile that had never stopped remaking his face entirely every time she saw it. "Very good," he said. She turned back to the mountains. The sun was almost gone, just the last burning edge of it behind the peaks, and the sky above was going to deep blue, and the first stars were becoming visible, steady and cold and permanent. Inside the house, Clara's voice rose in the particular tonal register of someone who had conclusively won an argument, followed immediately by George's voice, responding with the particular register of someone who had not accepted this conclusion, followed by a thump that was probably a book being set down with emphasis, followed by laughter, both of them. Clara and George dissolving into the laughter that siblings fell into when the argument and the game were both equally real, and neither was more important than the other. Wilhelmina listened to her children laugh. She felt Stephen's arm around her. She felt the October cold on her face and the warmth of the coffee mug in her hands and the ground solid beneath her boots. She thought about the woman who had arrived at this gate 7 years ago with nothing but fury and fear, and a toddler, and an absolute determination to know the truth. She thought about what that woman had believed was possible and what she had given up hoping for. She thought about the door that had opened wider. Everything that she had believed lost had come back to her in forms she had not expected and could not have predicted and would not have traded for anything in the world. "Come inside when you're ready," Stephen said, pressing his lips to her temple. "Mrs. Hannigan is threatening something with dried apple that she says will solve the temperature problem." "Mrs. Hannigan's solutions to the temperature problem are always excellent," Wilhelmina said. "They are," he agreed. He went inside. She stood on the porch alone for another moment, just her and Buck and the darkening October sky and the last of the light. She thought about her mother, and about the small grave at the western edge of the pasture, where Agnes Atwood was buried near the sky and the grass and her grandchildren. She thought that her mother had been right about most things, as she had been inclined to be, and that the specific thing she had been most right about was this: go anyway. She went inside. The door closed behind her, and the warm lamplight took her in, and the voices of her children rose around her like music, and Buck settled himself at the threshold with the gravity of a creature who understood his responsibilities, and the October night outside was cold and clear and full of stars. And inside the Double M Ranch house on the Wyoming plains in the year 1889, there was a family that had been built from the broken pieces of a dark past, and a hidden betrayal, and a door that had been opened wider at exactly the right moment. And the family was whole, and the family was real, and the family was everything. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything that mattered. Stephen looked up when she came into the room, and his face did what it always did when she came into a room, that quiet and complete attentiveness. And she went to him, and he reached for her hand, and she gave it to him. And Clara was talking over George, who was talking over himself. And baby Agnes stirred in the next room with the small protesting sounds of a child who was deciding whether waking up was worth the effort. And somewhere outside Buck gave one decisive bark at something and then was quiet again. "Well," Wilhelmina said, to no one in particular and to all of them. "Well," Stephen agreed. And the Double M Ranch kept on, through more winters and more summers, through droughts and good rains, through arguments and laughter and all the ordinary, extraordinary days of a life fully lived. And the Mercer family was rooted in the Wyoming territory like the mountains themselves, changing with the seasons and remaining, always remaining, the thing they had chosen to become together. The woman who had arrived with a child on her hip and the rancher who had opened the door wider had found in each other the thing they had each, without quite knowing it, spent their whole lives looking for. And they kept it. And it was good.